archaeology, teach archaeology and tourism. Today's agenda is presentation of a paper entitled Emancipation in Takaungu, Kenya, Protests and Tradition in an African Post-Slavery Community, 1907 to 1990. The paper is in line with the broad theme entitled Multidisciplinary Research in History and Archaeology. But as I want to apologize for starting late, we are sorry. The paper is presented by two colleagues. The first one is Dr. Ngala Chome, who is a research fellow at Ghent University, Belgium. His area of specialization is on violent extremism and politics in East Africa. He holds a doctorate from Durham University, England. Then the second presenter is our very own head of department, chair, Dr. George Gona. Dr. Gona is a senior lecturer in the Department of History and Archaeology. He holds a PhD from the University of Wintwatersrand in South Africa. His area of research interest is labor history and the history of underground in East Africa. Then discussant is Mr. Akoko Okech. He's an independent researcher, PhD candidate at Ghent University, Uganda. So
we are going, representation is 1 hour. The presenters
themselves on that time will take the share of the time. After presentation, we shall have an opportunity to ask them questions. But before that, the discussant will have to come in. The audience will be invited to ask questions. Thank you very much. The authors, you are welcome. Who wants to begin? Welcome, Dr.
Thank you very much. I believe this might be you. Thank you very much, Mwalimu Gilbert. I am Dr. Ngala Chome. You have been prepared to expect two speakers today. Yes, it's a collaborative project between myself and Dr. George Gona from the History Department, the University of Nairobi. And well, I'll start off by saying that this is also part of a wider project titled The Aftermaths of Slavery in East Africa, held at the History Department at Ghent University, of which I am conducting my postdoctoral fellowship. So it's part of my postdoctoral fellowship research. And you know, I would like to mention Professor Felicitas Baker, who is the principal investigator of the research project. She might be asking questions later or contributing to the discussion later. The sort of theme that I am particularly interested in this wider research project is post-enslavement histories particularly on the Kenyan coast. The particular focus being what you're terming the central coast, that is anywhere between the town of Mombasa, Kilifi, and Malindi. And in a discussion, of course, I'll explain why this is the case. This is also a region that was largely a plantation zone, plantations that were worked by slaves, most of whom were sourced from, what we could describe as Eastern Central Africa, modern day Malawi, and southern Tanganyika. So in the communities of the Yao, especially, being shipped through the northern East African coast through Zanzibar. A labor structure that was constructed under Arab rule in Eastern Africa, especially Busaidi, Omani Arab rule, and a lot of which has been written about. So the disclaimer is that I'm not here to talk about that rich history that has been the subject of a lot of history, a lot of historical research on the coasts. What has been less discussed, of course, is the sort of long-term effects, the sort of long-term impacts of enslavement, of the fact that slavery did exist in this part of the world. How did it end up affecting society long after its abolishment? In this case, we want to discuss concepts such as emancipation. We want to discuss concepts such as freedom and agency. What do these concepts mean, especially when discussed from the perspective of the freed slaves themselves and the people that they interacted with? It's really the sort of focus of this project, a focus of today's discussion. The other disclaimer I have to give is that this is ongoing research. So we are not today presenting final conclusive results. In fact, after this presentation, we shall be continuing to conduct field research on the coast. So therefore, today we'll be presenting what we are seeing as sort of emerging themes from what we are already collecting. And in this case, we shall be sharing what we've been collecting in a small village on the Kenyan coast known as Takaungu, what had been in the 19th century a town that was under the control and rule of the Mazrui family from Oman, which Mazrui family has had a long history of residence and settlement on the East African coast. After they were deposed from their outpost, which was Mombasa, and some members of the family moved north and settled in places such as Mambrui, Takaungu, and Mtanganyiko. In the south of Mombasa, places such as Gazi were known to be Mazrui outposts after their supplantement, after being supplanted from Mombasa by the Busaidi clan during the time of the imposition of British colonial rule. Of course, the starting point for us, as I was beginning to explain, is after slavery was abolished. In our case, and when I say our case, I mean in the case of the Coastal Protectorate, that would later be joined by Kenya colony in 1963 to become part of independent Kenya, is that slavery was abolished by law, or as some authors have described, it was written out of existence, in the sense that it was not the outcome of consistent struggles for freedom by the slaves themselves, even though historical examples of this do exist. But a lot of the slaves were freed merely by law, not as a result of struggle or of social activism. And this has particular impacts, especially on what happens after abolishment. It dictates the pathway towards emancipation, which we shall discuss, towards freedom. Like I've mentioned, I mean, this is not new when you're talking about slavery on the coast. My colleagues in the project Aftermath of Slavery at the University of Ghent are mainly focusing, they're mainly looking at mainland Eastern Africa and looking at the aftermath of slavery on mainland Eastern Africa, also a very understudied subject as well, for various reasons that I will touch upon. For the coast, Freddie Cooper's work stands out as being an excellent study on slavery along the coast of East Africa. Edward Alper's Ivory and Slaves, particularly looking at the sort of international dimensions of slave trade in Eastern Africa, but then also kind of focusing as well on the source region, which was East Central Africa, the northern Malawi Yao region, its connections to Zanzibar and the Zanzibar Sultanate and the wider Indian Ocean world. Patricia Romero focuses on Lamu, also brilliant study on how slavery took place, in this case, before the 19th century, towards or during the 19th century. The questions of abolition, emancipation, and its aftermath when talking about slavery on the coast has also featured. It's a subject that has concerned researchers looking at this subject in East Africa. So again, our paper does not claim to be the first. We are not the first people to be asking what happens after slavery. This is something that that has concerned other researchers who have also sort of given their own views on whether at all it is important to speak of slavery after its abolishment. Do slaves continue to exist as a category, as a social category, or are they merely incorporated by freeborn communities, by freeborn people? Integration is a huge subject when discussing slavery, especially on the African continent, where distinctions between slave owner and slave may not necessarily have aligned with racial categories, for example. So therefore, there's a mutedness, not only in the literature, but also in these communities themselves, finding it difficult to discuss this subject. A painful past, yes, but also which seem not to require any examination, debate, and discussion after its legal abolishment, it seems, to a lot of people. Of course, it has been concluded variously that it could be also the silences could be also the result of the weighty historical burden of shame to speak about the subject of slavery. Many people will not want to be identified to be of slave ancestry or to once have been slaves themselves, and would pick up different identities or new identities, if you like, across the continent, identifying themselves as emancipated, as freed, as members of free communities. So how then do you study such a subject that carries all these sort of negative connotations. And also, is it not simplistic to assume that slavery does not, the fact that slavery did happen, that didn't have an impact post its abolishment? How did emancipation actually happen? How did integration actually happen? Especially on the East African coast, the conclusion has been that, looking at studies done by people like Justin Willis and Frederick Cooper, for Frederick Cooper, the conclusion is that slaves became squatters, joining the cultivating class of landless coastal inhabitants or coastal residents, many of whom would later, decades later, define themselves as Mijikenda, for example, or Swahili. They would join the ranks. Slaves were known to have joined the ranks of these communities, and therefore their category as people of slave ancestry disappears with that sort of integration. Yeah, and as I've mentioned, due to the historical burden of shame, the refusal to also speak of that of that past of slavery continues to relegate the question of slavery into a distant dark past. When it appears in contemporary debates, it is always blamed on the Arabs, for example, or on continued forms of racism, but not looked at carefully as an experience that continues to shape social relations, that continues to shape ideas of agency, ideas of dependency, and ideas of hierarchy. And so therefore, scholars such as Thomas Spear, with his magisterial history of the Mijikenda peoples of the Kenya coast to 1900, mentions the existence of slavery, but only in passing. In fact, he does mention of the existence of the institution of slavery as being one of the cultural institutions in which Mijikenda peoples also, the Mijikenda also sort of engaged in. Rarely does he make a comment on what happens to these Mijikenda slaves after abolishment in 1907. The same goes with David Parking on his examinations, especially of the ritualistic cultures of the Mijikenda people. Mijikenda people, I would describe them really to be coastal African groups residing on the immediate hinterland of Mombasa, Malindi, and who are known to have accepted. This is also the sort of consensus that requires further examination, but are known to have integrated a lot of the runaway slaves that would run hinterland, escape hinterland from coastal plantations, seeking freedom and gaining in that process new identities, new Mijikenda identities. Janet McIntosh, who also does an excellent study on social hierarchies in the town of Malindi, and even sort of, it almost threatens to talk about the existence of a sort of coastal racial language in how people think of themselves and how people think of the other in Malindi town. Also mentions slavery as being one of those historical experiences that may have contributed to these later day ideas of hierarchy, but not as a very predominant experience. So again, there's this way, there's a gap, yes, in discussing slavery how slavery impacts society after abolishment. There's a gap in that, but also there's a way in which historians have talked about the subject in passing and thinking of other categories such as identity, race, as more important, not only for study but also for the people who are being studied. But to take the path that we are seeking to take, and arguing that slavery had deep impacts, or slavery has relics that still continue to exist in a community such as Takaungu. The past of slavery continues to shape even until today how people view each other, how people think of social hierarchy, is to suggest that the past of slavery is not as silent as the literature would make us believe. And so therefore, in the second part of this presentation, we will do a deep dive into the interviews we've conducted in Takaungu, where, the interviews begin to tell us that we need to be thinking differently about this question of shame that people of slave ancestry, in places where they were long thought to have been integrated, and in fact even negotiated their lower status to become people of significance, people of importance, the readiness in which they're willing to speak about that past, but also how it continues to shape their community, will come out in the second part and in the interviews that we discussed. In the third part, we shall then be trying to make some preliminary conclusions around our contributions into the literature about what we think emancipation should be looked at, or shame, or the meanings of freedom. What do these really mean? How does emancipation really take place? Is it a one-off event by law? Is it a long, protracted process that interacts with other social themes, social processes? We'll be coming to that. I'll be coming back to speak more on that after this part that my colleague Dr. Gona will take charge. So karibu mwalimu.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, I have a very bad cold. And, I hope I won't transmit one. Okay, thank you. All right. Thanks, Ngala, for that introduction. I will do two things. First of all, I'll lay the foundations of what Takaungu is like today, because there hasn't been very much change from what Takaungu was then and Takaungu is today. So I'd like to show in passing the social hierarchies in Takaungu, and then move on to talk about how local racial hierarchy and discourse is maintained in Takaungu, and then in particular deal with the way in which those of slave ancestry still valorize being descendants of slave ancestry, and perhaps that is the critical contribution to our this research and this particular engagement. So Takaungu is a historic Swahili town located in Kenya's central coast between Mombasa and Malindi, in what today is the Kilifi County. It is approximately 10 kilometers south of the town of Kilifi. As you drive from Mombasa to Malindi, just past Vipingo, Socil Estate, things are changing very fast there. There's a cement factory and other things happening. So sooner or later, the Socil will not be something to identify the place you go to turn on your right to go to Takaungu just after you finish with the Socil plantation. Takaungu was established in the 1930s by Rashid bin Salim. 1830s by Rashid bin Salim. I don't want to go deep into this history. This is well told in the books. But I want to mention that there are basically 5 groups of people that live in Takaungu. The first group are the Mazrui. These are landlords. They are claimants to Islamic knowledge and former slave owners. For decades, they dominated farming and trade and controlled religious practice in Takaungu. They live in central Takaungu and have their own mosque, the Shak Mosque. And that's very important for our discussion. The second group are Arabs. That include the 2 main subdivisions, depending upon their origin in Oman, Hadramaut sections of Arabia. They also live in central Takaungu, to the left as you drive across the town. The Hadrami occupied a subsidiary political position, but included many successful men of commerce and scholars. The third group that live in Takaungu are the Bajuni. They live close to the creek. They largely subsist on fishing. The section they live on, they tell us that it was given to them by the Mazrui. They also have a mosque of their own. The Swahili, I'm grouping this big group, the Swahili, Choni, Kauma, and Giriama. I don't want to call them Mijikenda. I just want to identify with what they call themselves, are the fourth group. They live in the outskirts of the town, in the Langoni area. Langoni, Kiswahili, is the gate, that is the entry into the town. So they live in the outskirts. For many years, they provided farm labor to the Mazrui, and they worked as domestic servants in the Mazrui and Hadramini households. They were basically freeborns. They are not of slave ancestry. Now, the last group is hardly mentioned, and that's the group that we're interested in this research. This is a group of slave ancestry. The fact that they're not even talked about, they're not categorized anywhere when we discuss about the groups that live in Takaungu, tells a lot about how, or the silences that Ngala was talking about, silences about this group of people. As already mentioned by Ngala, these were assumed to have integrated into among the Swahili and the local ethnic groups, and yet there are ways, in many ways, there are ways in which they identify themselves in a manner in which they continue to valorize their masters, as we're going to observe in a moment. Now, other than the 3 mosques built for the 3 main groups, there is what you call the Juma Mosque, close to the creek that is specifically for Friday prayers, and all Muslims worship here every Friday. It must be noted that while the Bajuni and Hadrameni had their mosques, the Mazuri had a say about what went on in these other mosques. Land was owned by the Mazuri, and they hold the right until today to dispense it. The Bajuni and a few families have titles to land that they were afforded by the Mazuri. Both the Mazrui and the Hadramini Arabs consider themselves to be superior to the Bajuni, Swahili, Choni, Kauma, and Giriama. Now, I want to move into this interesting area that Ngala really alluded to, the manner in which everyday speech, everyday engagement in Takaungu shows how local racial hierarchy and discourse is maintained. For many years, the Mazrui and Hadramini claimed Islamic knowledge, which they shared both at the mosque by leading prayers, these are the imams, and at the Ijumam summons led by the Imam Joma. The Mazrui ruled Takaungu's racial hierarchy, since they were also owners of slaves. They were also madras teachers, which earned them respect among both converts and those of slave lineage. It is typical for Takaungu, that's a person born and lived in Takaungu, to remark that madras Ustad, that is the teacher, Muhammad or Ustad Halid, was my teacher or instructor. Now, while this appears to be a regular method of Muslim knowledge impartation, in Takaungu, it reinforces racial hierarchies and was primarily a display of dominance. Islamic rites were crucial sites for hierarchical racial expression. Those who sat at the high table during madras rituals, at the point where people were graduating in Kiswahili kuhitimu. This is the annual ceremony to commemorate the birth of Prophet Muhammad, both in Takaungu, in the north, and further to the north, Lamu. Now, to reverse this arrangement that you as a freeborn could sit in the high table, one would have to acquire Muslim knowledge, but also you should also gain finances for you to be allowed to sit in these high tables. So sitting in those high tables quietly indicated which place you belong in terms of the hierarchies in Takaungu. Everyday speech equally expressed these racial hierarchical discourses. If in Takaungu, someone calls you, like, hey, come here, instead of calling your name, this is a racial slur. Someone who is not of your racial category but addresses you by your name indicates that you are gaining respect in Takaungu racial discourse. If someone called you Mwadadi, it was most likely due to your racial pigmentation. You are a black and so inferior social class. If someone called you Muhammad, because Muhammadi and Muhammad are the same people, but Muhammadi is the one of black lower class. Muhammad belongs to the upper class and has light complexion. Utterances such as Nyinyi ni Manyika, that is, there is actually a whole repertoire of literature on this idea of Manyika. Ngala dealt with that, in his PhD, but other scholars Justin Willis, Thomas Spear, David Parkin, and others have actually discussed this idea of Munyika. Simply, it can mean uncivil, it can mean those from the interior, it can mean backwardness. So it again gives that racial hierarchy, racial discussion, so to speak. Another way in which racial discourse happens is if someone calls you too, this is an expression of possession. Charo is owned by us. Charo too. Now I'm using the very Takaungu, right? So it means Charo is owned. The slave masters, it's owned by the slave master, implying that this particular Charo has slave ancestry and belongs to them. There are cases where, for example, people use the concept Jama. Those who have lived the coast, when someone calls you Jama, at that person, you could be Muslims at that moment, whether you Muslim of Arab origin or of convertee. But when, again, those with light complexion call themselves Jama, they are actually in that process excluding that group of black people. So the concept Jama is just not used. It could be used to mean all that is community, but it can also be used to actually show very clear racial categories. For decades, most served as sites of hierarchy expression in Takaungu. Traditionally, Mazui and Adrame served in the most committees and gave the finest sermon. Nevertheless, these roles reserved for small Mazui and Adrame, who were chosen from among others. The belief was that individuals were custodians of Islamic knowledge, hence entitled to those roles and have traditionally led Muslim processes. In some cases, persons who began the construction of mosques gained exclusive access to what happened within those mosques. For example, the mosque in Tagunya, that is the Bajau section of Takaungu, the Bwanyenye, I'm using a term that one of my informants told me. Bwanyenye means upper class, right? The Bwanyenye who was involved in the construction of the mosque actually created an attack door for himself to use privately. Normally mosques have 2 doors. That again tells you the racial hierarchies expressed, not just mere existence, but even in the manner in which somebody would actually create a door, an extra door for private use in a mosque. Now, what are we suggesting in this? We are suggesting that in Takaungu, social hierarchies around which social relations are conducted and mediated, particularly by religion, largely Islam, and from which slavery and slaves were positioned, played a very critical role in the social relations in Takaungu. The slaves, of course, slaves existed here since before the abolition in 1907. However, as I will just demonstrate in a moment, former slaves or people of slave ancestry have been quite aware of these hierarchies. They are very much aware of these hierarchies, and they engage with these hierarchies. And the existence of these hierarchies, social racial hierarchies, do not preclude their identity. They do not run away from their identity because of these racial hierarchies. As Ngala has suggested, people assume that there is no talk about slavery in post-slavery society. And then, Bob, we go to Takaungu, and people talk about slavery, or at least in the day-to-day engagement, you will know this somebody talking about slavery here, or somebody is identifying as of slave ancestry. My interest now is to demonstrate how former slaves or people of slave ancestry valorize slavery. In other words, they still identify with their slave past, which is opposed to the assumption that people are ashamed and will not even want to talk about it. Just about 5 or so examples that can illustrate our argument that this valorization of slavery by former slave people's slave ancestry indicates that the idea of slavery and slave trade is still live in Takaungu. Now, the first one, in everyday speech, it was typical to see persons of slave ancestry argue in impassioned ways, right, over who was higher status as a slave. It's quite interesting. A case in point is when two people debate about how they were bought as slaves. One would say, we ulinunuliwa na pesa za mfukoni na mimi nilinunua na pesa za kashani. You were bought by money that pocket change money. You were bought by pocket change money. I was bought by money that was removed from a vase. You know, in Arab culture, the vase is very respectable to have a vase. It is locked, well, you know, kept with sometimes oils and all that. So you would find people of slave ancestry debating about which money was used to buy you. You were bought by pocket change, so you're of a lesser slave level. All right, I was bought by money from Kasha, a vase. So I'm of higher. So for these two, these are very clear that they're debating the public. They don't fear that they're people of slave ancestry. Another way they valued their past slavery ancestry was the manner in which they celebrated proximity to higher status individuals and families, that is, slave masters. And I'll quote again, mimi bwana nyumbani kwa Halid kuingia na mlango mbele na nikatoka na nyuma. Mimi Halid's house, I walk from the back door and walk through the back door. I'm so familiar with that house. In other words, they don't mind identifying with their master. So that proximity, that they're so familiar with the house of the master, they don't care telling you that, look here, man, I don't mind. I mean, I am of ex-slave, and they identify very clearly. So this conveys familiarity and closeness to a slave master's home and environment, almost like belonging to that family, regardless of the individual's status as a slave or having slave ancestry. The other practice, offering a wife, daughter for the sexual pleasure of a visiting high status individual, that is, a slave master. Yes, slave master is visiting home of ex or former ancestry, slave ancestry, one with slave ancestry. They offer their daughter or wife to the slave master. And the word is, you have to please the master when he appears. That's the mantra. You have to please the master when he appears. The other one, and for me, this was the origin of this research that some time back in 1997, a friend of mine talked about it. He lives in Takaungu, and he talked about this, that there are people who, after ceremonies, after Ramadan, and people of slave ancestry would walk across Takaungu with a big basket of goodies. They have been rewarded by their master. And they would actually talk freely and say in Kiswahili, nimeangaliwa, I've been looked after, or I'm being taken care of. This was 1997. I told this friend, I said, look, this is something that we go to research on. So when Ngala came, and I know he's been dealing with these issues, I mentioned it to him, this particular incident, and he said, no, I think we should pick it up and do it. And this is actually the outcome of that. So this is something that has been manuring my head, and Ngala popped in, and we thought we should actually pursue the matter. And as we observe, it's really showing something interesting that we have not taken really interest in the past. Now, there's another thing that you can observe of people of slave ancestry. Souls of slave ancestry have a difference to authority. They are acceptors. No matter how you coerce an ex-slave or someone slave ancestry to, on Friday prayers, you take njoo bwana tuende tuswali, come on, let's go and pray, let's go at the front. They say, no, I'm okay, no, we just, so they like sitting right at the back. They have this difference to authority. Many a time our informants ask them to, and these are the people we're talking to join the front row, but they flatly refused. One other very interesting aspect of this discourse is consent to bury a person of slave ancestry. In two instances that the people we were having conversations with told us that the two instances where somebody dies because they know this person, they are friends, somebody dies in their arms. And as a Muslim, you're taught how to deal with somebody who has died. You prepare them, you cover them, you all that before the other rituals of washing, etc. But the family members will tell them, please just wait for a moment, just wait outside there. And they'll put the body at a place, waiting for ruksa. That is ruksa in Swahili, meaning permission or consent to clean the body, consent to bury. So the master will leave Takaungu and go to Kilifi, where now this family lives, because their former slave has died. They'll come, oh, okay, I've seen. Ruksa, I'm just demonstrating. I've given you consent to bury, given you permission to bury. So that again gives that picture of slave and slavery ancestry still playing in the everyday life of the Takaungu people. There is also this idea of some slaves who were given land by the Mazrui after the abolition. They were given land somewhere north of Kilifi town, not very far from there. Is a place called Mtondia. And after a couple of years, they abandoned these farms, sold, and went back to Takaungu. Where are they going back to? Where they are familiar with. They're going back to their slave masters. they are more comfortable near their slave masters than they are in the freedom that they're supposed to be enjoying, including having been given land. Now, the last perhaps interesting one is slave ancestry, person with slave ancestry drank water used to prepare the body of a high status so that one will access knowledge. This is about reverence of the high status. So we are proposing that the social structure that allowed for slave trade was not entirely undone or vanquished. Slavery was abolished by British policy in 1907 by the stroke of the pen. But we need to discuss slavery in more deeper ways, particularly the idea of emancipation, which Ngala will conclude on this evening. That the stroke of the pen by signing off that slavery has been abolished is not the end. Emancipation is a struggle. It's a long-term struggle because these people in Takaungu seem to be seeking that emancipation because they seem to still revere the species that. Now, to finish my section of the presentation, there are two traditions that I want to discuss that indicate that some of these social hierarchies and the ways in which society is organized in Takaungu came to be challenged. And I think the two instances that I want to talk about. The first one was the questioning of who should actually lead prayers in the mosque, right? We have already said in the past that majority of the time it was a Manzuri or Hadrami, Arab. So this came to be questioned by the freeborn Muslims. What our friend Ngala is Hassan Makimako talks about the new ulama. This the new knowledgeable, those with ilm. Ilm is knowledge. These are the new ulama in Takaungu, the freeborns. They have imbibed Islamic knowledge. They also have Western education. They begin to question this idea that it's only the Mazrui or the Hadrami who should actually lead Muslim prayers. So we're suggesting, therefore, local racial hierarchies and traditions were challenged in Takaungu when local elite who had acquired both Western education and learned and imbibed Islamic knowledge through the madrasa system and as well as through the study of the Quran rose up to question Mazrui's dominance in their claim to their custodianship of Islamic knowledge. This occurred around 1989 when an imam delivered an ijma sermon at the Juma Mosque, someone that had no relevance to the people of Takaungu. So a converti Kauma, this a local old man, raised his hand and said, no. We cannot continue listening to people who do not even know the Quran. If they know the Quran, they are not relating it to the realities of Takaungu, right? The social issues that we are actually encountering, the problems that we have of division, right? How he was making reference to something that was happening in Kuwait. So this Goma said, no, we cannot continue like this. So one Hadrami elder asked, so who do you think should do this? He said, no, this one. Now, the person who was appointed was my former high school mate. When I was in sixth form, he was in, I think, Form 2 or Form 3. And at that time, he was the deputy headmaster of the primary school there. So he was appointed. And the people asked him, are you sure you were able to, lead Ijuma sermon? He said, yeah, I'm ready to do it. He said, okay, you come by the house this evening and come and pick some material to help you prepare. This gentleman never appeared in that house. And in the Friday mosque prayer or sermon, he did it without reference to any material, and people were happy. For 7 years, he was the imam of that mosque. He led the Friday Juma prayers for 7 solid years. This is a freeborn. In other words, the idea of dominance of and claim by the Mazrui to be of the people who hold this Islamic knowledge, claim to Islamic knowledge, and is the one for them to lead. That came into question, and it actually ended. The second one was on burial practices. Now, after the takeover by the freeborn imam, he made very radical. He gave radical sermons, telling people about the divisions in Takaungu, the racial hierarchies that are not permissible in Islamic practice. But one burning thing among them was this idea that people in Takaungu are buried, and it's basically a Muslim town. They are buried separately depending on your hierarchy. So you have a section of the burial area called Mwembe Mavi, and I'm wondering why they even gave that the name. When you go back, we're going to ask, because the name Mavi is shit. So the place is called Mwembe, which is, the place is full of mango trees, which is Miembe, mango trees. But how the place is called Mwembe Mavi, that I think we need to find out. And next door, the Mwembe Mavi is fenced, but no gate. On the other side, just across the road, same place, is the Wema space. What Wema, the high ranked. That's where they used to bury. So this had been burning among people, those who were asking questions. We come from the same world, we should go back to the same world. Muslims don't make those distinctions. So why do we bury, our dead in different cemeteries, and we are all Muslims? So it so happened that Hadrami Mama, a woman, died. And as the young people prepared the grave for burial, they also had an ex-slave man had passed on. So this Imam of Jama Mosque said, what I've been talking about in the mosque on Fridays is going to happen today. They are going to be changed. We are going to bury the ex-slave by the side of this woman. So a few high-class individuals made a lot of noise, resisted. They had to call the chairman of the mosques. It happened that, somebody, the old man that I knew when I was young, and he appeared. They told him, look, this is what is going to happen today. And he said, okay, let it be. In other words, it took the death of an ex-slave or somebody of ex-slave ancestry and a freeborn imam to actually lead a protest against this division in the burying of in the burying in Takaungu. From that time to date, they decided the burial will be in the Wema side, that is the high class side. Everybody who dies as Muslim will be buried there. Until that, until that area is exhausted, will then people move to start burying in the Mwembe Mavi section of the burial sites. I'll stop there. Ngala is going to conclude our discussion.
Let's put our hands together for Dr. Ngala.
It's going to conclude.
I don't want to catch a cold.
Yeah, please, it's bad.
So, I mean, the presentation, yes. So the presentation is we're not done with our presentation, and also I'd like to highlight that Mwalimu Gona, we are taking a risk here of sounding vindictive against the people of slave ancestry in Takaungu. So I would like to discuss that as well. That examples of protest and resistance do exist, have existed in history, right? So what we are finding out, we are not just saying that people of slave ancestry have lived past abolishment, continuing to valorize the institutions, the hierarchical institutions that underwrote much of their bondage. That examples of resistance actually did exist. One common example, of course, not just in Takaungu, but in that entire area, was simply to run away from the plantation. One thing that we have to note is that long before the legal abolishment of slavery in 1907 by British colonial law, the institution of slavery and the slave trade and the institution of slavery were very much in decline already. So there wasn't as much resistance as well at the coast from the slave owners themselves. A lot of the slave owners had already lost a lot of the slaves to Christian missions, but also to hinterland communities. And the other part of our research that we haven't mentioned is that we shall also be studying and conducting interviews amongst these people of runaway slave ancestry, especially in the hinterlands of Malindi. I mean, they're quite well remembered, quite well known, these families, especially due to distinctive cultures that they have maintained, and they claim originate from the original homeland in modern day northern Malawi. There are also examples. I think we need to do more work, because a lot of the practice of slavery in Takaungu that we didn't explain it at the beginning is that it very much happens in the domestic sphere. So a lot of it is intimate. It's based on intimate relationships between slave master and slave, and after abolishment, patron and client, or former slave master or former slave owner and former slave. Discontinuing practices of ruksa, for example, that a person of slave ancestry or someone who was once a slave cannot be buried until the person who owned them historically has to give permission, is existing really because they continue to exist in an unequal relationship of master and client long after abolishment. But even within those relationships, those unequal relationships of power, negotiations have been possible. You know, so almost like negotiating to better one's condition within their position of marginality, right? So, for example, there are certain rights and expectations of master, of patron, that, you know, if you are to be respected as a master, there are certain conditions, there are certain requirements that you have to fulfill for the people that follow you, who may once have been people that you actually owned, right? So it's the 5 minutes, yeah. So I just wanted to make that clarification that there's still more work we need to do in looking at the spaces in which resistance did happen amongst people of slave ancestry. I mean, our paper is titled "Protest and Tradition," and that the conclusion here is that emancipation is a complex process, and it's a long, protracted process as well, that does not end with formal legal abolishment, but also, you know, it's actually a process that you know, takes decades and interacts with other processes of social change, such as, you know, spread of Western education. This was I need to go to the last slide. Yes. Migration, social mobility. You know, there are examples of people of slave ancestry from Takaungu who become people of significance and importance later in life that we actually do know of. Yeah. But also throughout time, the declining significance of these local social hierarchies, you know, the Mazruis, for example, the declining significance of the status that was once attached to the Mazrui family over time is also something that then underwrites the long story of emancipation throughout the decades after abolishment. So I will conclude this there and invite questions. Again, I have to say this is something that is research that is ongoing. And so therefore we are really looking forward to your contributions, to your questions and critique as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. May I take this opportunity to welcome our discussant, Mr. Koko.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the two presenters for an excellent paper. I think this is one topic, as Ngala rightly pointed out, that tends to be overlooked, or rather has not received sufficient attention, especially in recent times. I think most of us are caught in the post-colony. We hardly look back at what was happening in the pre-colonial world, and the relationship that were also created by another form of power, hierarchy, and domination. And so as they made the presentation, I kind of remembered the civil rights activist and non-violent movement, Martin Luther King's quip about emancipation in the American context. And King was wondering that to the African American, given the context and the condition in which this thing was claimed to have been their freedom, what is freedom if what you were granted is freedom to whirlwind and thunderstorm? He compared the lot of the African Americans to the incoming white settlers who are moving into the United States and were being allocated 150 acres each and a whole lot of support to begin agriculture. And to the African American who'd now been told you're free, And so that raises an important question of what is freedom in this context? If the abolition of the, if you merely declare legally that something has ended without abolishing the material and the socio-economic, psychological condition that produces the differences and the hierarchies, then what is freedom in that context? Can you have social equality in that context without abolishing the material and the socio-psychological condition that creates the hierarchies and the differences within a population? And so I think, although this is work in progress, Ngala and Gona have done an excellent job in setting firm grounds for their engagement with this subject in two ways. One, I think, as Ngala demonstrated, it is not that the past of the enslaved is silent. Rather, to borrow Michel Rolf-Trouillot's title of the book, Silencing the Past, if the past is silent on this aspect of slavery, it is because the academic narratives, the academic discourses on slavery on the East African coast, especially Kenyan coast, then seems to have silenced it by assuming that slaves were integrated within the local community, and with it, everything else that went with slavery. And so the literature then, the review of the literature then sets a sound background for their engagement with what exactly goes on that still reminds us of the continued or the persistent existence of these hierarchical relationships. And that, I think, methodologically then they've turned into a very useful method to write the history or to capture what exactly goes on that reminds us of the continued existence of markers of these relationships. And that is, they've used the everyday rituals, weekly rituals, what you find in the spoken language, to tease out the meanings and the markers of differences and of hierarchies and of privilege, which were brought about by this institution of slavery. I think this is important because other than the fact that if you're Kenyan, perhaps you'd know that it is only the Mazrui family, not even the Kenyattas, it is only the Mazrui family who have a land act to their name. The Mazrui Land Act. Attempts were made in 1989 to repeal it, but subsequently in 2012, when they appealed, the High Court ruled that the repeal of that constitution was unconstitutional. So it still stands, and the 3,000 acres of the Mazrui land is protected by the Mazrui Land Act. And so that is a legal reminder that something changed and something didn't quite change. And so when they go then into this discussion of the everyday way of speaking and relationships, where they take us to the mosque or the masjids as a space where hierarchies, differences is produced and reproduced, but also, as Gona said towards the end of the presentation, as a space where these hierarchies and differences can also be contested. And so we are able to see how these relationships continue to exist and how they are also continually contested by the population who we assumed have long been integrated and had long disappeared from history as such. And so I think for me then, there were a number of questions that this presentation raised. And the first one, I think, was Ngala's. And Ngala tells us that the idea of race, or the concept of race here, is very fluid in both categories, the slaves and the enslaved. But how useful is it? What do you mean by race in this context? What word would you use for these markers of differences, markers of privileges, ideas of superiority, of freedom for others, one set of humanity, and then markers of subordination, inferiority, and even dependence, both material and spiritually, by another set of this population? So which would be the appropriate word, race or what in this context? Is race useful even as a concept? And then again, towards the end of it, Mwalimu Gona spoke about this contestation within the mosque and who delivers the Friday prayer sermon. And I was asking then, what were the competing schools of Islamic schools of thought, if any? How are they challenging the old order? And then the last one is a practical dilemma, because most Muslims have become object of surveillance by the state of late. So how do you as a historian conduct research amongst a population of people who are highly surveilled, spaces that are highly surveilled? How do you negotiate your way around this? What are some of the ethical issues you deal with? Thank you.
But my doctoral research interrogated this concept of race, which and you're right. I mean, in this discussion on Takaungu, we are really discussing how, I mean, we're really talking about social hierarchies, yeah. And therefore you ask then why is race important, especially when you argue that these hierarchies are also flexible, situational, contextual. People can negotiate their way up these hierarchies. And they're mainly hierarchies of status, I have to say, without kind of referring to these as class distinctions. If we're talking about class, then it introduces another discussion that could lead us into, Marxist analysis of which this is not really what's happening here. The culture is also very important in producing these status categories. So even kind of describing them as class identities is not enough, if you see what I mean. And status also very much locally defined. It's how the local people define what is of status, as opposed to a universalist understanding of the concept of status. It's also very important to consider that. But race is important, especially on the coast. But even when it happens in other locations in the African continent, due to a recurring theme in local traditions of foreign origins. So therefore, for a very long period of time on the coast, to be of foreign origins, especially to be of an African, to be deemed to be an African, during the colonial period, it was to be deemed to be non-native, or to be even classified as non-native, was to be deemed to be of high status. It is a racial it is seen as a racial category because also of its attachment to Arabian origins or even Persian origins, right? So there is then a sort of what you call primordial markers as well of race, and Mwalimu Gona was making mention when he was doing that deep dive description of how on everyday speech in Takaungu, terms such as wajomba, watu wa nywele ngumu, watu wa nywele singa, terms like these are pointing directly to bodily features, for example, that speak to the idea of race. But it is not to say that this is the only way in which racial categories are defined in this local context. You can fall off from being a Muarabu, quote unquote, especially in a place where it became increasingly difficult, even for the Mazrui, to prove their Omani origins, okay? Generations after generations of them being resident of the East African coast, not knowing how to speak Arabic, for example, to what extent then are you an Arab, right? So that now your Arabness is being defined in very locally contextual ways that will include other markers such as wealth. Is someone who is poor but of Mazrui heritage considered first of higher status, and secondly as an Arab? You would find that there are local terminologies as well that exist to describe those people as not being of Arab. It'd be something like Morabu Koko, and terms such as this. Anyway, this is something that I did this my during my doctoral research, and hopefully will be coming out as a book as well. But the point here was to suggest that these hierarchies are very pertinent to how the society in Takaungu is organized. And the institution, and that the institution of slavery itself, especially in the domestic sphere, was subsumed within this wider structure of hierarchy. Yeah, and so therefore, when you're discussing emancipation, how does emancipation proceed in what is a distinctively hierarchical society, is the question here. Especially when you're looking at very domestic sphere, in a very domestic language. You're looking at a relationship between former slave owner and a former slave who is a woman, for example. Former slave owner who is a man. How does that woman negotiate her emancipation decades after abolition, for example? A lot of those negotiations take place in very private ways, in very intimate ways. Yeah. So and these are the things that we still need to interrogate, how emancipation takes place in those complexities. So I hope that addresses your question satisfactorily. But then there were questions addressed to you, Mwalimu. I don't know if you want to come and take, what was the theological charge of the new ulama, and also the ethics of researching Muslim coastal communities at a time of counterterrorism. I think that was the...
With the second question on the competing ideological position between the old ulama and the emerging ulama, that we need to pursue further. We need to really interrogate. We didn't go into details, and thanks for raising that. It's something we're going to. Now, on race, Ngala has dealt with that. The last thing of ethics, I think that the entry point is very important for Takaungu, and I think for every other place where you go and cut out interviews. There's the people that we have interviewed so far, and I'm happy. I know these people personally. They really were of assistance to in introducing us to other people that when we're in the field, you would actually judge by the manner in which these gentlemen were being embraced, like, oh, someone potea vipi? I mean, you had to literally run away from these many um, um, greetings and embracing and all that. But it's something that happened, which I think we need to consider when we're in the field. There's somebody I was, we were introduced to, and we went to a Mazuri home where this gentleman had gone to do repairs, right? Household repairs. So he took some seats from the house, came to the veranda, and we were having our interview. It was going so well, 20 minutes down the line, and then the Mazrui joined. I mean, came with a group of young people. He said, unafanya utafiti, you're doing research. I said, yeah, thank you very much. This is my name, Then he posed the question, make sure that you say good things about the Mazrui. That messed up the whole thing. Because subsequently, the informant became very timid. Nothing was coming forth. It was very unfortunate. So you're right in terms of the research, field work, and ethics. One has to be careful, but right. I didn't want to go. Ngala says we are from there, but I think scientifically that's not enough to justify. I was avoiding to say we come from the area. No, I mean, that I mentioned that this idea of kuangaliwa, being looked after, was an idea that we discussed with this colleague who was actually in our Arabic department here, 1997. And because I'm a historian, I said, but this is something that we go to. But, he's interested in Arabic as a language and all that. So he wasn't so keen. So when we had this discussion with Ngala, I said, no, this is something that we got to visit. And I told him about that story, 1997. So it's not that it's something that is emerging today. It's something that has been, manuring my head, and Ngala has gone into it, into PhD area. Now we are venturing into the post-slavery histories, so to speak. So we need to really be very careful. I wouldn't want to really worry so much about the surveillance, as long as you are the right people, in terms of people who are known, people who know that you're not there to really research about anything negative. You want just to put things into historical perspective, and you engage as much as possible. Yeah. But the second question about competing, I think, is a very very pertinent issue we need to pursue. Right. Thanks.
Thank you very much, presenters. We are very grateful for that very interesting presentation. Thank you very much, discussant. We have learned a lot from this presentation. So I would like to say that we should appreciate them by clapping for them again. So this is how we are going to do it. The audience is divided into two. We have those of you who are here, then we have another group which is online, I suppose, isn't it? So we will begin with 4 people here. Then you'll answer them. They are good to ask questions, you'll answer them. We shall return to the next 4, and then we'll go online. But I will start myself. I'm very, very, I've been very, very interested, especially on the origins of these, the slaves or former slaves, descendants of slaves, where did they come from? This may influence the way in which they react. For example, how does the legacy of slavery continue to influence political activism and cultural expression? Does it, could it be that they feel, are some of these among the locals, the local groups, those you call the Kauma, the Choni, are they among the slaves? Will it influence how they react? As Dr. Gona was saying, you give us a very good picture. The subservient way in which they are behaving. Thank you very much. Maybe you'll react to that one. Then we shall go to Dr. Mbongi. After Dr. Mbongi, who else? Yes. And then who else? Yes. So please give the microphones. Thank you very much. Welcome, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you, Ngala and Dr. Gona, Dr. Ngala. Thank you. Yours is a case of a teacher and a student working in some kind of collaboration, which is good and a lesson for our students. That is it Chenua Achebe who said, "When you have washed your hands," I'm not quoting verbatim, when you have washed your hands properly, you can eat with the elders. I think that is the case we are seeing here between a former student and a teacher now working together as colleagues. I think for our students that's very encouraging. And thank you, Ngara, for the good work you continue doing. Now, your work really is deeply with what I see as imperatives of historical retrieval. And you contribute so meaningfully to our understanding of how the shadows of slavery, continue to persist into what you see as a post-slavery era, not as a mere historical residue, but as an active element shaping identity, memory, and also social relations. Something I find very, very enriching, to say the least. The second thing is, and I found it very interesting, we want to see whether on the side of Christianity what's happening, that religion reinforces instead of destroying not only racial, but slave master hierarchies. How is Christianity doing if that is what is happening in a situation which is predominantly Islamic? Then the second point I found fascinating is, to extrapolate what Frederick Cooper called the past of the present. In his book, Africa After 1940, we now use it in a different context. It's actually really in Takaungu, the past of the present, invoking history as a way of reinforcing and configuring present identities. So I found that wonderful. Leave alone the concept, Ruksa, Bwanyenye. I used to visit a village in Choni, close to Mtanalewa's home. And there's a particular guy who could call me Mjomba. I don't know what it meant. Probably would tell me whether this labeling works outside Takaungu. Because this guy, every time I go back there, he still calls me Mjomba. Labda if he wants kuniangalia, I won't buy. Now, let me, in that spirit of critical reflection, let me just raise a few issues. The first one, Mwalimu Gona, this is an historiographical depth and sources. You were nearly preempting this question, but I have to raise it. You're interviewing people you say you know personally. You have had a relationship and all that. And I was wondering, how could you elaborate now on the range of these primary sources? Particularly those originating from Takaungu itself. How would these oral histories and local traditions weigh, let's say, against, colonial archive or sources in reconstructing the past of slavery in post-slavery era? I found that interesting, and maybe you can say a few things about this. The second one is on what I see as, for want of a better word, the terminological precision. You use the concept post-slavery, very broad and sometimes, I think, contested. Could you clarify how you define it in this context? Is it chronological? Is it legal? Or is it experiential? And whatever trajectory you take, what do you think are implications that it has in framing this community that way? And my last one, so that other people can ask, you grapple with the issues of continuity versus disruption. I hope I understood you well. There is a strong emphasis on the continuity of enslavement legacy from what you have really told us. And I was wondering, how does your research engage with counter-narratives that emphasize, some kind of rupture within the freed communities, rather than this enduring trauma that you very vividly present? At some point, I was feeling so sorry for those children of former slaves, and I was like, oh, how do you deal with that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the good presentation. My name is Peter Mnyoto. I work for the government. I'm also a student here. I have two quick questions. And one is on the issue of relationships between the 5 groups. Because Dr. Gona mentioned about the issue of burial sites. And I'm asking myself whether these different groups in terms of relationships, and I'm looking specifically at marriage, were there any marriages between the different groups? And then the second question is on a follow-up. I want to tie my second question to the first question on what we are seeing today in terms of influx of Kenyans going to the Middle East for work. But coming from the coast, I come from the South Coast, I've seen even before what we are seeing today, coastarians used to go to work to the Middle East. Now, is there a connection between the people following their the slave masters to be taken care of or for work or something like that? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Henry Médard. I had 2 questions. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for this very fascinating presentation. But I have 2 questions. One, which shows just my ignorance of the coast. You said there were 5 categories in this place. Wouldn't there be a 6th one with the migrants from the inland? But I mean, it's just a small precision I would have liked to have. And my second question is about this big question about the transformation of slavery into patronage. So I would have been interested to see how the patronage differs from post-slavery and slavery and the evolution of these relations. Thank you.
Hi, yes. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Gona and Ngala. I also had two questions that thematically related to, I think, what other people are saying. One is a broader question about methodology, and I would love to just hear more of your thoughts about the benefits and the limitations to being from the region when you're engaging these conversations, and just sort of a broader question about, I guess, the art of oral history. I think something I struggle with, because I'm also looking at issues on the coast, social history, is how much to insert my own voice when I'm having a conversation and trying to sort of poach these questions, and whether or not I just sort of sit back and let somebody else tell their story. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about sort of the art of oral history. And another question I had is, we've talked a lot about historiography, and one of the points that the discussant made was about silencing, sort of silences in the scholarship. And my question related to that is your thoughts about the historiography of the coast more broadly, specifically because in the literature, it's always referred to as the Swahili coast. And I feel like a lot of what I'm getting from your talk is the importance of really getting precise with groups and with regions. And so the question is, does the term Swahili coast to capture the whole region, does that do more harm than good? Does it reinforce silences? Is it a category that we can continue using? I'd just love your thoughts on that. Thank you, guys.
Like to go first.
Because there were a number of questions that were kind of relating to each other, I think I'll just try and answer them together. But I will start with the very simple question of where did slaves come from? The evidence, especially for much of, and the obvious answer, of course, is with East Central Africa will be modern day Malawi. Southern Tanganyika was really sort of the zone of social slaves for sort of its own reasons as well. Yeah, amongst especially the Yao, but also Nyasa land, Wanyasa. I think the general term actually for people of slave ancestry for the coast of Kenya. If you're talking about freed slaves in mission stations from Rabai to the mission station in Freetown, and you do not want to allude enslavement as being part of their story, we would say Wanyasa. As people of the Nyasa, where they may have been from in Nyasa land. We may not know, but then it also speaks to a historical the idea that many of them were shipped either overland or across through Zanzibar. Zanzibar was a huge slave market, for example, through Mombasa and into the northern coast from Mombasa. There is always the question. Mwalimu Gona, I don't know if you'll speak to this, but there's always the question, are people of Mijikenda origin, were they also subjugated to slavery by the Arabs of the coast? But I have to say that discourse in itself plays into sort of modern day discussions of alluding guilt to the Arabs for having committed this historical sin. Sometimes it is usually brought up in political discussions to shut them up in terms of particular claims that they make towards their Kenyan citizenship or lack thereof. For example, during the Mwambao movement of the 1950s, when various Afro-Arab political organizations across the coast of Kenya made claims towards what was legally defined as or termed as the Coastal Protectorate to not be joined with the rest of Kenya colony in the event that Kenya gains its independence from the British government. The sort of backlash that they received, these supporters of the Mwambao movement, would be this this historical scene would always be brought up, that first and foremost you are former enslavers anyway, and in this kind of discourse it is never really defined who the people who are enslaved were, and the distinction really becomes Arab slavers and Black African formerly enslaved people who are now seeking to turn the wheels of privilege. But historians of Mijikenda history, such as Thomas Spear, who I listed at the beginning of the presentation, does speak of Mijikenda ethnic groups in the pre-colonial period actually having practiced slavery themselves, so that the institution of slavery is not exclusive to non-African groups. It's not exclusive to Arabs, not exclusive to Europeans. In fact, it is the sort of underlining thinking I also mentioned at the beginning of this research of my colleagues in the wider research project who are studying similar trends, legacies of slavery in mainland East Africa, where slavery may not, the categories of slave owner and slave did not neatly align to racial categories such as Arab and African, for example. Yeah. But to answer your question very directly is to say that majority of the slaves did not originate from what is modern day Kenya, but further in the southern East African coast. I feel like we've discussed more than once, Dr. Mbongi, the role of religion in my various other presentations I've made here. But to speak to this presentation today, in particular, I'll say that, and it is still, even for me, but it's also still a subject of debate, the role that was played, for example, by Islam in justifying the ownership of slaves. I mean, in Christianity as well, I think in the Bible, there's tons of examples of slave ownership. It is a historical fact that is described in both books, the Quran and in the Bible. But Islam, as a sort of theological tradition, has been used both to justify ownership, not only ownership of slaves, but also the relationship between slave owner and slave. Whether a Muslim can enslave another Muslim, these are questions that are also addressed in Islamic theology. And I really would not like to get into that because I'm not an expert in that field. But in Takaungu, yes, we see Islam being used both as a legitimating factor of maintaining social hierarchies. So, for example, people who claim to be Arabs or to be of Arabic heritage or origin, which is to say they come from the geographical heartlands of Islam, for a very long period of time have also claimed to have superior knowledge about the religion and therefore have the right to speak correctly about the religion. This is also a place that has Sharifian families. Sharifian families are families that claim descent from the Prophet himself. And so therefore, they are seen to possess baraka or blessings that they can issue other Muslims. Yeah. So yes, in that way, then Islam plays a role in maintaining the social hierarchies. But also Islam, especially with the spread of Islamic reform movements from the, in the East African coast, Swahili coast. I'll address your question, Kambi, later. But there are also examples of challenges towards this. These hierarchies have been challenged using Islam as well, especially via Islamic reform. Salafist movements have been known to challenge this, that anyone who is a Muslim can acquire the rightful knowledge, especially by relying on the Quran itself, on the Hadith, but not on the mystic sort of realities of blessing and mostly Sufi tradition. In Takaungu, Islam in fact was used as a charter of liberation to open up the main mosque to allow preachers from other non-Arab social categories to take the stage as well and to preach to the community, especially in the 1980s. But this is also kind of happening across the entire East African coast. The arrival of these new ulama who have acquired knowledge, a trend that begins in the 1970s, out of their own accord, and are feeling that they have grown enough to challenge traditional Muslim clerics, yeah, and therefore challenge even the continued existence of practices that may have emanated from the practice of slavery as well. So Islam plays sort of religion. Let me just say, religion can play both roles of liberation but also of subjugation. I want to address the question of methodology because I think it's also a question of positionality. Who are you as Ngala Chome and Gona to study objectively such an experience from a place that's not very far away from most of our villages ourselves, yeah, and us being seen as, I mean, to what extent are we seen as researchers, and to what extent are we seen as, say, Mijikenda, by the people who are speaking to us, for example, sons of the soil? It's a question that I encountered when I was conducting my PhD research as well. But also, I'm not surprised I'm encountering this question here. It's something that I think about. And yes, it does pose a challenge. And mostly the challenge is, there's a challenge of ethnicity, of ethnic group or ethnic identity, ethnic affiliation. But there's also a challenge of gender as well, especially when you're studying post-enslavement. As I've just explained, a lot of the spaces of resistance that we have not quite touched in our research may have existed in a very domestic, intimate sphere that we may actually not have access to altogether, right? How comfortable is a woman in telling us, for example, some of the her experiences, sharing to us her experiences as the person of slave ancestry, continuing to encounter these patronage client relationships that they continue to have with former slave owners, whether in Takaungu or in Mombasa. And would they be willing to sit with us? And even if they do, what silences continue to happen in that exchange, talking to us, not only as people of the coast, but also as men, yeah? So we're and the thing about it is always good to be aware rather than to try and what do you say, ignore these challenges, some of which are ethical, and does it mean then we collaborate more with people who may have an interest but also may have better access to some of these issues, some of these communities? I will tell you, during my PhD research, when I was studying racial thinking in Mombasa, it was very difficult for me, for example, to speak to high status, people of Arab descent in Mombasa. Not because I was not seen as that, but also mostly because I was of coastal heritage. So there's also a way in which maybe they would have spoken to Dr. Ombongi more than me, because I seem to have more intimate knowledge of some of these very coastal, some of these things are they're discussed in very locally, locally produced, very contextual local languages. He just asked the question, what does it mean when someone keeps referring to me as Mjomba? I will have to say, not in that very coastal way in which, say, Mijikenda would refer to Mjomba, Adzomba. You know, when we say Adzomba, it's not the same meaning. It may just be social anthropologists are better at describing what I'm trying to say. Emic and ethic meanings. There are those languages that are more internal, have more internal meaning, and then there's languages that are produced for foreigners, for people who are seen as external to this culture. We are much more seen as internal to this culture, that is also very well aware of its internal distinctions and hierarchies and divisions, right? So always the question is, when we are conducting this research, I have to think about my positionality, what I'm being told, the things that I'm not being told, or the things that are being told by body language, for example. All these things are alive to me, and they continue to inform my analysis, my writing, and of course, our research is always subjected to peer review, and they will always be highlighted. And I think the hope is always at the end to stand the test of academic integrity. Yeah, it's always the hope. Yeah, but that's my view. I think maybe Mwalimu Gona, you can address it, this question of methodology and our own positionality in your own way. I would not want to answer all the questions. I want to leave some to Mwalimu Gona. This is the good thing about being the first one to go, because then I can just choose the one that are easy to me. Kambi, I'm sorry, I think you came late, but we did talk about coastal historiography at the beginning, and the main point there, of course, was how has slavery been? There's brilliant scholarship on the slave trade and the institution of slavery on the coast, especially pre-abolishment. And we mentioned Freddie Cooper's work, Edward Alper's work, Patricia Romero's work as well. So we are lucky in the sense that we have great scholarship already existing on how the slave trade, the coastal slave trade took place. But what we're finding is, past 1907 for the Kenyan coast and Zanzibar, because in Tanganyika it was different. There was a more gradualist abolishment of slavery there, and there's work that has been done. Henry Medard is here. I think he edited a volume that has work from Tanganyika that describes how enslavement or slavery there was, the abolishment was more of a gradualist process, even in a legal sense. But for Zanzibar and the coast of Kenya, it's 1907. The slavery is abolished. What we find is that from the colonial record is that there is no longer talk of what happens to the ex-slaves. Well, for obvious reasons, because the British didn't want to be seen like they did not abolish slavery, right? So they don't want to talk about it, because in fact, one of the official reasons, justifications of colonization was to abolish slavery. So yes, so don't talk about it. We've abolished it. It's no longer a problem. Kind of the official thinking. The literature has a number of kind of pathways that it also describes. So for Frederick Cooper, for example, a lot of the slaves for him became squatters. They merely became landless people joining the ranks, the cultivating ranks of the landless people of the entire coast, or joined, if you're looking at Justin Willis, joined what British colonial officials would describe as the floating population of urban Africa, which is the casual labor force that emerged in the large cities of East Africa, in this case in Mombasa and Malindi, and disappeared. The category of ex-slave or slave disappeared or was subsumed, integrated under these what to historians then became much more important categories requiring investigation, and that the slave origins of these individuals no longer mattered after abolishment. It's kind of what the literature seems to be concluding. But we are taking a different path, and we are saying no. I mean, if you look at a place like Takaungu, where we are seeing continued existence of practices of hierarchies that have an origin in slavery, then the past of enslavement did not actually really disappear from the historical record, or at least from how people talk about the past, right? In Takaungu. It also raises questions about ideas of shame, because one of the reasons that, I mean, historians would say, oh, people don't want to talk about it because it's shameful to talk about having been of slave ancestry. And then we find that in Takaungu, people very proudly profess their slave ancestry, and having belonged to a better master or having been bought in a better way than the other. As recently as the 1980s, as recently as the 1990s. So what does that then suggest to this idea of shame, for example? What does it even tell us about the idea of emancipation? What is emancipation to an ex-slave? That's, yeah. That's, yeah. No, I was going to stop there.
Thanks. Ngala, you've addressed many of the issues that have been raised. Kambi, this idea of Swahili Coast, I think there's a point, Kenya Coast history, that, Swahili Coast was accepted. But I think to assume that the coast region was Swahili dominated to the extent that it was to be called Swahili Coast was erroneous. People have to, the debate on who's the Swahili is I think that is concluded. They are Swahili people, right? And I think to debate whether there is a Swahili is neither here or there. The point is to give people agency. Talk of the Choni as Choni. That's why I didn't want to use the concept Mijikenda, because there's nothing like Mijikenda, right? There's a Choni, there's a Kauma, there's Giriama, and the other groups that speak close dialect, but identify. It's the same way Kalenjin, right? The Kalenjin speaking peoples, because you have a Tugen, you have a Keyo, you have all the other groups. So, and if you talk to these people, they want to be identified as Giriama and not Mijikenda. When it comes to politics, you want to amalgamate into a bigger group so that you articulate a better position to enjoy the cake, right? But Swahili Coast will be too broad. It's good if you're looking at people, the Giriama, you're looking at the Giriama drum. Just deal with the Giriama drum. There are differences between a Giriama drum and a Choni drum, unless you want to really do a very broad study. But there is very specific, and somebody will tell you this is a bumbumbu, right? And a bumbumbu of Giriama looks like this. This is how it is done, and this is different from any other. Now, the problem of methodology and issues of ethics, I think in our case, the idea of positionality is important. But like I said before, there's a point at which you have to begin somewhere. And you begin with the people you are familiar with. Subsequently, they introduce you to people. And that's the way, particularly with the oral interviews, you just can't go to a stranger and ask them you want an interview from them. You got to be watched, and this watching is normal, right? I say, look, Kambi, I think I referred you to Kambi. I referred you to some people north of River Galana, at the center, the old men and women center. I'm sure when you went to say I was referred to you by this, then there's that acceptability. Then you after that. So I think that also addresses Dr. Mbongi's concern, right? Methodologically, there seems to be a problem with the studying people you're familiar with, but who will study these ones? There should be somewhere to begin. Now, the other, a very interesting question that Dr. Mbongi asked is about, we've dealt with continuity, but there's the element of disruption. There is disruption. And I think we decided with the Ngala to be deliberate about this, that we're going to focus on the, what you would call the downtrodden ex-slaves, because the people like Edgar Manasseh, Rajab Sumba, these are really disrupted. When we had a meeting the last meeting we had with Ngala, we had a long discussion on this. Our argument is we don't want to, the literature by Rajab, where people talk about Rajab Sumba and people like the famous former slaves, is as if the story is we were so incarcerated, but here we are now we have conquered, triumphantic emergence, all right? I think that story has been told. Manasseh tells it. Rajab Sumba's stories says it really. Joe Hamisi, right? Is a Mnyasa. Yeah, Joe Hamisi. Yeah. So that story has been told. We are telling a story of this, Mwalimu like says, subaltern voices of these ex-slaves who don't mind talking about that past. Yeah. The other one is, but Dr. Mbongi, thanks very much. There are these summary that you gave us, and it really captures what we want to say. The 3 points that you made. Thank you on that. Now, Binad, I think Ngala talked about their colleagues dealing with their upcountry nuances around slavery. There aren't really people from upcountry that have made home in Takaungu, except people from Pemba, Zanzibar, the fishermen. I mean, when we were visiting, there were many Pemba fishermen who actually have made homes there. Ngala was to look at this because you're the one who talked about slavery into patronage element. Maybe you can do that, but no. But Peter, there are intermarriages. This one gentleman who was very, very emphatic about his Kauma. Kauma is one of the local groups. He's very proud of having Kauma origins. He looks Arab. He's part of the Hadramat side. But when I interviewed him, he said, "Look, I don't mind saying that I'm Arakari, to use a local terminology, an Al-Kaumi, right? Al-Kaumi is of Kauma ancestry, but he looks with the curly hair and all that. But he says our grandmother was a Kauma. So indeed there was that much. But where it came to the issue of burial, then that is where the problem. I don't know where the grandmother, having converted, I didn't ask him. Maybe that's something that we need to ask, whether when the grandmother died, was buried in the Mwembe Mavi section or was buried in the Wema side, where the husband was an Hadrami Arab for that one. That's quite an interesting thing we would wish to pursue. Another one, Dr. Mbongo is concerned. I think we addressed that. The idea of interviews vis-a-vis colonial record. There's quite a huge silence on post-slavery issues. When there is the signing of the Emancipation or abolition to 1912, that record is there, right? The list of people who were emancipated, that is there in the archives. I think we have had opportunity to look at that, and we'll go in deeper. But the colonial record, the colonial archive, unfortunately, is silent on that. Thank you very much.
In fact, we now want to go to online colleagues. Can we now handle those questions? Professor Felicitas, can you please ask your question? And maybe you can tell us who you want to answer the question. Can you unmute? We are not hearing you. We can go to Mwalimu Kiriama.
I think Felista has left. She said she was leaving shortly. I think she may have left. Hi, thank you, George and Ngala for that good presentation. I want to ask quick questions. One, Ngala was saying that when you are looking at the hierarchy, you cannot look at identity. I don't think you can start discussing hierarchy without looking at identity, because identity is the one, in fact, what you have been talking about, the ways the identity hierarchies are constructed is based on the identities of those people, whether you are an ex-slave or what. So I think it's important that you look at identity, and also you look at the issue of memory. These people are descendants of they were not slaves themselves. They are descendants. So it should be important for us to look at how do they remember their past, and what is it that makes them think that they were descendants of ex-slaves. So I think identity will be an important question. Another thing is, when you are talking about Takaungu, you should not forget Mchanganyiko. Mchanganyiko is a site which is at the end of the Cliffy Creek. When you are going to Cliffy, on your left-hand side, at the end of that creek, there's a big site of Mchanganyiko, which was a big slave trading center. And that's where they said most of the slaves who are in Takaungu were offloaded. Then they were brought to Takaungu. So then, which means then that the slaves at Takaungu did not only come from outside Kenya, but they might have come from the interior of Kenya itself. Unfortunately, the last time I was there, the place has been destroyed by farmers and whatever. Another thing is, Ngara, you talked about people forgetting Watoro. In fact, there's a lot of research which has been done in Watoro, on the Watoro. If you read the thesis by Linda Marshall, There was an archaeological thesis where she looked at the Watoro and what they left behind. And also there is articles on the legacy of slavery on the Kenya coast where we talk about the Watoros. And especially the late Ting also talked about the masquerades. And the masquerades, these are basically the former slaves who want to assert their identity, but then as a way of exerting their identity. Finally, very important is that in the South Coast, people, there is these nuances of slavery and ex-slave descendants, because in the South Coast, there's a time when they can openly talk about being slave descendants, but there's a time again they don't want to talk about being slave descendants. And I found out that the reason to do that is that because they had been given, they see their masters as benevolent masters, so that if they say that they are descendants of slaves, they will annoy their masters. And I see this is what is happening in Takaungu, that these people see these people are benefactors, they have given us land, they have given us all that we need, so that if we talk about them not being our masters, they may get annoyed and maybe they chuck us out of this place. And maybe also we need to look at the issue of trauma. How far does trauma go when somebody has been traumatized? Like now, these are maybe the 5th or 6th generations, but still they suffer the trauma of their parents. So that maybe that is one thing we need to look at. Finally, I think when you talk about post-slavery, let's not talk that is the issue after slavery, but let's look at the post-slavery paradigm. This is a paradigm which talks about that how people use the past to understand the present, so that when we talk about post-slavery, we're not talking about what happened after slavery, but let's see how people are using the past to understand the present. Thanks.
Lecturer.
I think Professor Felicitas Becker left the meeting, but she wrote on the chat, and I will read her question. The persistence of this strength of hierarchy is exceptional if you take continental East Africa as a whole, as a frame of reference, and arguably even compared to most of the coast, including Zanzibar. I would suspect that this has much to do with the exceptional status of the Mazrui family. Perhaps the basis and the ramifications of their continuing dominance during the colonial period can be brought into focus a bit further. She had a second question, then she says very quickly, but the question, I wonder about the register of language in which the senses about continuing clientship are represented. If someone talks about themselves as being si mtumwa wa mfukoni and an expensive slave, is there a hint of utani about this? There you are. In the Tanzanian context, I could suspect as much. So are these hierarchies perhaps not as serious as the language on the face of it suggests? There you are.
I think there's a tendency to downplay everyday expressions. I'm Takaungu. Felicitas is not from that context. I'm Takaungu. When he hears that kind of language, it's very clear that there's a racial slur. It's very clear. If somebody calls you Hamadi, they know that you may not be a slave, but you are of a lower class. When they call you by your name, again, there is a level of acceptability. When they just call you, don't happen, it means you're just a non-entity. You have no significance or urgency. So we take note of her concerns. I'm just addressing the last point. I think of the two issues we'll record and we'll revisit. Right. Thanks. Ngala.
Maybe two, and then I'll address the last point from Felicitas. I think there are other misunderstandings about how I was discussing identity and hierarchy. The point there is that these social hierarchies carry social valence, but they are flexible and can be negotiated. So these are also not very static. Yeah, sometimes are based on context. And that even people of slave ancestry, there are examples that they've been able to negotiate their way up the hierarchy by acquiring status through various social qualifications. So that was the point I was trying to make when discussing hierarchy. And identity as well, not just in the context of Takaungu. Identity has also been discussed by various other scholars as also not being of a static. Identity is also not a static social category, and identity itself also changes, especially when you're talking about Swahili identity on the coast. It's fascinating how historians and anthropologists have tried to understand this category of Swahili. Who is a Swahili? But also that challenge is really because of the flexibility and the negotiability of identity itself. These also play into Takaungu society. I did not actually state that runaway slaves haven't been studied. In fact, I did mention it as one example of how slaves sought emancipation on their own account, was to run away from the plantation. I did actually mention this, and that it will be part of our continuing investigation of the sort of local ways of emancipation, but also of resistance and protest against continued enslavement. Yeah, I didn't get the question about masquerades because it was cut off. So I didn't get that question. In terms of the Mazrui and hierarchy, the Mazrui don't. I mean, yes, they are very important producers of Koso history, of course. I mean, they're very important actors in Koso history. But when we're discussing social hierarchies in Koso society, it is not a Mazrui phenomenon. It's not a Mazrui problem. It's really this idea of what is deemed as Arab and what is deemed as African that keeps producing a historical tension on the coast. One being deemed as more civilized and one being deemed as uncivilized. The idea of Mnyika. The Mazui are just one other groups that, because of their Omani ancestry, would occupy a higher status position in the Koso hierarchy, also being reflected in legal distinctions during the colonial period as non-natives, but also access to land, as Akoko mentioned earlier. So it's not a distinctively Mazrui problem. I mean, we also have the Busaidis are part of this, the Hadrami Arabs are part of this, and many others. Yeah. In terms of hierarchies and language, I think she actually mentioned that is it just Utani when someone of slave ancestry would argue with another and mention that their ancestor was brought highly than the ancestor of the other. Whether or not it's a matter of social jokes, it does speak to the fact that the past of enslavement still carries significance in how people talk in Takaungu society, that there is no silence actually, that people actually could still talk about the very fact that enslavement did exist in this community. That was the point we were trying to make there. Whether it's a joke or not, whether it's actually true or not, but it points to the fact of a past of enslavement.
So we need to bring it to a close. I seize this opportunity to welcome the Dean, Dr. Mbongi, to say a word, and maybe you can close. But otherwise, thank you very much for coming here, colleagues and people from outside. We are very, very grateful. We don't take it for granted. Asante sana.
I think we can do better by putting our hands together for Mwalimu Wafula for conducting this session. Thank you very much, Mwalimu, for doing an excellent job. Mine, friends, is just simple. I stand here to thank everybody for being part of this conversation continuously for, I think now, many years, and those of us who are here today. But specifically, let me say a huge thank you to Dr. Ngala. You are our shining star. Every so often we are talking about you in the department. And I've said this on this podium before. We anxiously look forward to having you here. Please, it is time you come home. And the home is the University of Nairobi. So please don't go very far away. So we still have that strong hope that you'll be part of us sooner than later. We need those ideas here. Dr. Gona, thank you for this incredible presentation. I always call it leading from the front. That is, we have talked about this with you. That's what chairs are supposed to do. You sit in front here, you lead the rest from there. And thank you for delivering that inspiring, you know, and your energy is fairly contagious, if I may say. Both of you brought brilliance and clarity to the topic. And it's a gift that I will want to learn from both of you as we move and as we grow. We are grateful for your time, passion, and generosity in sharing your knowledge. And we hope that when this study is complete, you will now come and present a full study here in form of a book or something like that. So thank you very much. Now for our site audience, thank you, friends, colleagues from different institutions, our research affiliates. I can see our friend at the back there. Nani was here, Kambi was here also. Our students, our MA students, you're doing fairly well. I'm still concerned with our PhD students. I still welcome them to be part of us. And also our colleagues. And I think more importantly, Dr. Mayandi, welcome home. You occasionally have been online when you were on the other side. Dr. Mayandi, for those who may not know her, is part of us. She's been on leave of absence, serving the country in other capacities at the Public Service Commission. But she's now back to where she belongs, where home is. And Ngala, that's where I was saying home is here. my teacher, Dr. Muyandi, went, and she's back home. I also went some point. I was away for almost 8 years. And where did I come back to? Home. So that is the language we want you to go away with. So thank you very much. Our online audience, we want to thank you very much from different parts of the world. Our colleagues from the United States, I saw a friend from India, and also a friend from all the way Japan. It must be going to midnight, I think 1 o'clock or thereabout in Japan, and I saw a colleague there very patiently listening to us to the small hours of the morning over there. So thank you very much. I saw our senior colleagues, actually. I saw Alamin Mazrui on our online audience. I saw Professor Susan Muda. It's very early in the US. For her to wake up and listen to us is quite a privilege. I saw our colleagues Feristos Becker from your current place of abode, and also our friend and colleague Haman Kiriyama from Kisii University. These lectures are really attracting a lot of interest from within. He was also from home, and we hope that sometime he will come back to where he belongs, home. Friends, it is not an accident that I'm giving this thanks today, because for me there's been a journey, Dr. Gona, of almost 6 years, actually coordinating this program of seminars. So probably today you asked me to give a vote of thanks as my chair, to also say thank you for having given me an opportunity to continue somehow coordinating this program, even after I slightly moved on to play a different role in the university. And probably today is an opportunity for me to hand it over officially to you, so that we can continue that tradition, which has now been associated with the department. And this was really some kind of renaissance, but the reality is that this is what the Department of History and Archaeology here at the University of Nairobi has always been known for. Thank you. God bless you. This is the last seminar we have had for this semester. We are resuming in September. Please wait upon us. We will be giving you another schedule that will run from September to December. So we will be informing you just in a bit our program that begins sometime in September of our staff seminars. Thank you, and I have a very good evening here in Nairobi, a good morning in the United States, and a good night for most of our friends in Asia. Thank you, and God bless you.